Sometimes the wrong target is the only one who chooses not to pull the trigger. The stove clicked twice before the flame caught, a soft blue ring flickering to life beneath a dented steel pot, and Ethan Cole stood there longer than necessary, watching the water settle into a slow, patient ripple as if it might tell him something he didn't already know. Outside, the night stretched quiet across the tree line, the kind of stillness that only lived far from cities, where the air smelled faintly of pine and cold dirt, and the only sound was the distant hum of insects fighting. The edge of winter. His house, a modest wooden structure patched together with years of careful repairs, creaked softly as the temperature dropped, each beam settling like an old man easing into a chair. On the counter behind him sat 2 bowls, not one, placed there out of habit rather than need, and even he didn't remember when he'd stopped correcting that mistake. He stirred the pot slowly, measuring nothing, letting instinct guide the motion, the same instinct that once kept him alive in places he no longer talked about, places where silence had meant survival instead of loneliness. The clock above the sink read 9:17 p.m., its steady ticking louder than it should have been, each second landing heavier than the last. Then the air changed. It wasn't a sound at first, not exactly. More like pressure bending in on itself, like the sky inhaling too sharply. Ethan's hand paused mid-stir. The spoon hovered. Somewhere beyond the tree-line, something tore through the atmosphere with a low, vibrating roar that didn't belong to any aircraft he'd ever heard, not even the classified ones. The windows rattled in their frames, glass trembling as a streak of white-orange light carved across the darkness, fast enough to blur, bright enough to burn an afterimage into his eyes even from inside. Instinct snapped in before thought could catch up. He killed the flame, moved to the back door, and stepped onto the porch, boots hitting wood with a hollow thud. The night was no longer quiet. The air carried heat now, faint but growing, along with a sharp metallic scent that didn't belong to this planet. A second later, the impact came, not an explosion, not exactly, but a heavy, contained crash that shook the ground just enough to make the railing vibrate under his hand. Somewhere in his backyard, something had landed. Ethan didn't rush. Rushing got people killed. Instead, he stood there for a breath longer than most would, listening, measuring, letting the world settle into whatever it had just become. No follow-up shockwave, no fire spreading, no voices, just the faint hiss of cooling metal and something else beneath it, something irregular, almost like breathing. He stepped off the porch and onto the grass, the cold soaking through the soles of his boots as he moved toward the tree-line, each step deliberate, controlled, the same way he used to move through uncertain ground miles from home. The trees parted just enough to reveal the crater, shallow but wide. Earth pushed outward in a rough ring, and at its center lay the source of the light now dimming into a dull glow. The object wasn't large, maybe the size of a motorcycle, its surface smooth in some places, fractured in others, faint lines of fading energy tracing across it like veins losing pulse. Ethan's gaze shifted, because something else was there, a figure, partially obscured by the shadow of the wreckage, motionless at first glance, but not still. He saw the slight rise and fall, controlled, measured, like someone trained to conserve energy even on the edge of failure. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't call anyone. He just stepped closer. The figure moved then, faster than it should have, a subtle shift that repositioned it between him and the wreckage, as if even injured. It understood priority. The light caught her skin, blue but not flat, carrying a faint luminescence beneath the surface like distant lightning trapped under glass. Her eyes opened, sharp and focused despite everything, locking onto him with a precision that didn't belong to anything human. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The night held its breath again. Then, in a voice steady enough to ignore the damage around it, she said, "Target located." Ethan tilted his head slightly, studying her the same way he had studied broken engines and damaged systems for years, not with fear, but with quiet assessment, and after a second, he exhaled through his nose and said, almost to himself, "Yeah, that's going to be a problem." The blade never touched him, but it did not lower either. It hovered there, inches from his throat, humming with a quiet energy that made the air feel thinner, like it had been measured and found insufficient. Ethan did not move, not because he was fearless, but because he understood something she clearly expected him to miss. That hesitation meant she was not finished calculating. Her eyes tracked every micro shift in his posture, every breath, every flicker of muscle tension, as if she were running 1,000 outcomes at once and discarding them just as quickly. "You are not reacting correctly," she said, her voice precise, almost clinical, and Ethan gave a small shrug that felt heavier than it should have. "I get that a lot," he replied, his tone steady, the kind of steady that came from years of choosing calm when panic would have been easier. The night pressed in around them, the faint glow from the wreck casting long, uneven shadows across the disturbed ground. And somewhere behind him, back inside the house, the stove ticked softly as it cooled, a small domestic sound that did not belong in this moment. Her gaze flicked past him for a fraction of a second, just enough to register the structure, the light through the window, the presence of something that did not match the environment she had anticipated. "This location is unsuitable for termination," she stated, though it sounded less like a decision and more like a conflict she had not resolved yet. Ethan followed her glance back toward the house and then returned his attention to her. "Yeah, well, it is not exactly on any map. You would have," he said, and for the first time, something shifted in her expression, not softness, not yet, but a brief interruption in certainty. Her stance adjusted, almost imperceptibly, redistributing weight she did not have to spare, and Ethan noticed it immediately. The way one leg carried more strain, the way her breathing, though controlled, was not as even as she wanted it to be. "You are damaged," he said plainly, not as a question, and the blade lifted a fraction higher in response. Her focus snapping back to him with renewed sharpness. "Irrelevant," she replied, but the word came a half-beat too late. Ethan nodded once, as if confirming something only he cared about, and then, without any dramatic pause, he stepped slightly to the side, opening the space between them instead of closing it. "You can stand out here and finish whatever you came to do," he said, glancing toward the dark sky where the last traces of heat still lingered. "Or you can come inside before that leg gives out on you," he added, his tone unchanged, practical, almost indifferent, like he was offering a seat instead of a choice between outcomes. For a second, nothing happened. The blade remained steady, her eyes locked on his, searching for deception, for threat, for anything that would justify the equation she had been given. She found none. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant rustle of leaves and the faint hum of failing systems behind her. Then, slowly, not as surrender but as adjustment, the blade lowered just enough to no longer occupy his throat, though it did not deactivate. "This does not alter your status," she said, as if reminding both of them, and Ethan gave a small nod, already turning back toward the house. "Dinner is getting cold," he replied, as if that were the only variable that mattered. And after a brief pause that lasted exactly as long as it took for her balance to falter by a fraction of an inch, she followed. The door creaked open on hinges that had not been replaced in years, the sound dry and familiar, a quiet protest against movement. And Ethan stepped inside first without looking back, not because he forgot her, but because he trusted that if she intended to end him, she would not wait for permission. The warm air inside wrapped around them immediately, carrying the scent of simmered broth and old wood, a stark contrast to the cold metallic edge of the night outside, and for a brief second, the difference felt almost unreal, like stepping between two versions of the same world that refused to acknowledge each other. He moved to the stove, relighting the flame with a practiced flick, the blue glow returning beneath the pot, as if nothing had interrupted it, as if nothing had fallen from the sky. Behind him, she remained near the doorway, her posture rigid despite the subtle instability in her stance, eyes scanning everything with precise, methodical intent, mapping exits, distances, angles, all the variables that define survival in her world. The blade in her hand dimmed slightly, but did not disappear, its faint hum now blending with the low simmer of the pot. "You maintain routine under threat," she observed, her voice quieter now, less sharp at the edges, and Ethan reached for a spoon, stirring once before answering. "Routine keeps things from falling apart," he said, like it was a fact, not a philosophy. The overhead light flickered once, then steadied, casting a soft yellow glow over the small kitchen, over the worn table with its uneven legs, over the two bowls still waiting where he had left them. She noticed that. Of course she did, her gaze lingering for half a second longer than necessary, calculating again, adjusting again. 2 servings, she said, and Ethan nodded, not turning around. Yeah. He replied simply, then added after a moment, old habit. As if that explained anything at all, silence settled between them, but it was not empty. It carried weight, observation, the slow shifting of assumptions neither of them were ready to name. He ladled the soup into both bowls, the liquid steaming in the cooler air, then placed one on the table, and slid it slightly toward the empty chair before taking the other for himself. He sat down without ceremony, without invitation, lifting the spoon and taking a careful sip as if he were alone, as if the situation did not require acknowledgement. She did not move at first. Her eyes tracked the motion, the absence of hesitation, the complete lack of defensive posture, and something in that sequence did not align with any pattern she had been trained to recognize. You are presenting sustenance, she said finally, the words chosen with deliberate precision, and Ethan glanced up at her, meeting her gaze without challenge. It is dinner, he replied, as if the distinction mattered. A faint shift in her stance betrayed the cost of remaining upright, a subtle imbalance that even she could not fully mask, and after a measured pause, she took a step forward, then another, each movement controlled but not effortless. The floor creaked under her weight, an unfamiliar feedback that made her adjust instinctively, recalibrating to an environment that responded in ways her systems had not predicted. She stopped at the table, the blade still present but lowered, its glow reflecting faintly in the surface of the broth. This does not alter your designation, she repeated, though the statement carried less certainty now, more like a line she had been given rather than one she believed. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, watching her with the same calm he had shown outside. You keep saying that, he said, setting the spoon down with a soft clink, but you are still here. And for a fraction of a second, something flickered behind her eyes, not confusion exactly, but the beginning of it, a small fracture in a system built on absolutes. The steam from the bowl curled upward between them, blurring the space just enough to soften the edges of everything she thought she knew. And, slowly, almost reluctantly, she reached out and took the chair across from him. She did not sit the way humans did. Even as she lowered herself into the chair, her posture remained poised, balanced on the edge of readiness, as if the act of resting itself was something she had learned rather than something natural. The blade dimmed further, retracting into a thin line of light along her wrist, still present, still waiting, but no longer the center of the room. Her eyes stayed on the bowl in front of her, scanning it the way she had scanned him, measuring composition, temperature, possible threat vectors, and for a moment, the steam rising from the surface distorted her vision just enough to force a recalibration. Unknown compound, she said quietly, more to herself than to him, and Ethan gave a small shrug as he took another spoonful. Chicken soup, he replied, like it was the most obvious answer in any language. She tilted her head slightly, processing the term, cross-referencing it against whatever database lived behind those steady, luminous eyes, and finding no immediate classification that satisfied her. Purpose, she asked, and Ethan paused, the spoon hovering midair for a second before he answered. Depends, he said, then added after a beat. Keeps you warm, mostly. The answer did not resolve her question, but it did not trigger rejection either, and that alone seemed to unsettle her more than a clear threat would have. Slowly, with a precision that suggested unfamiliarity rather than hesitation, she reached for the spoon, her fingers adjusting their grip twice before settling into something that worked. The metal made a soft sound against the bowl, a small, ordinary noise that seemed louder than it should have been, and for the first time since she had entered the house, her attention fractured, splitting between the object in her hand and the man across from her who had already returned to eating as if nothing about this was extraordinary. She lifted the spoon, paused again, then lowered it back slightly, watching the liquid shift, calculating. Consumption is inefficient for rapid recovery, she stated, and Ethan nodded, not disagreeing. Yeah, but it helps, he said. Simple, unqualified. Another pause. longer this time. And then she brought the spoon up again, this time completing the motion. The first contact was minimal, controlled, just enough to register temperature and texture, but even that seemed to interrupt something deeper, a cascade of micro-reactions she had not prepared for. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in focus, as if the experience itself required processing. She did not speak for several seconds, and in that silence, Ethan continued eating, the steady rhythm of his movements grounding the room in something predictable. "It is acceptable," she said finally, though the word lacked the certainty of her earlier statements, as if she had chosen the closest approximation available. Ethan huffed a quiet breath that might have been a laugh. "That is high praise," he said, setting his spoon down for a moment and leaning back in his chair. Outside, the wind picked up just enough to brush against the side of the house. A low whisper that slipped through the cracks and reminded them both that the world beyond these walls had not stopped. She took another measured spoonful, this time with less hesitation, and the shift was subtle but undeniable. The difference between testing and participating. Her gaze lifted from the bowl to him again, studying not his movements now, but his lack of expectation, the absence of demand or fear or even curiosity. "You are not attempting to negotiate," she observed, and Ethan shook his head once. "No," he said, then added, "You look like you needed dinner, not a deal." And something in that sentence did not fit into any structure she had been given. No category, no directive, just a statement that existed without requirement. The room held that thought for a moment. The quiet hum of the overhead light, the soft clink of metal against ceramic, the faint, steady sound of two beings sharing space without a defined outcome. And for the first time since impact, the mission inside her did not feel like a straight line. The second spoonful did not require analysis, and that alone unsettled her more than any threat he could have presented. Her movements, still precise, began to lose the rigid segmentation they had carried before, each action no longer broken into deliberate steps but flowing, slightly, as if her body remembered something her training had tried to erase. Ethan noticed it without looking like he noticed it, his gaze drifting occasionally, but never locking in a way that would pressure or challenge. The same quiet awareness he used when repairing something delicate, letting it reveal its own faults instead of forcing them into the open. "Your physiology is adapting," she said after a moment, though the statement sounded less like a conclusion and more like a question she had not finished forming, and Ethan gave a small nod, wiping his hand on a worn cloth beside his bowl. "That is what bodies do," he replied, simple, unadorned, as if the complexity behind the idea did not need to be spoken aloud. She studied him again, but differently now, not searching for weakness or threat, but for inconsistency, for the hidden mechanism behind behavior that did not align with any model she had been given. "You were identified as non-critical," she said, her tone steady but quieter than before, low impact, minimal consequence. Ethan leaned back slightly, the chair creaking under his weight, and for a second, something like amusement crossed his face, not pride, not offense, just a recognition of the label. "Sounds about right," he said, and the lack of resistance to the classification created a new kind of gap in her reasoning. Targets protested, defended, denied, but they did not accept. She set the spoon down carefully, the metal resting against the ceramic with a soft, controlled sound, and her gaze shifted toward the window, toward the darkness beyond where the wreck still cooled, where the signal she had not yet sent remained untriggered. "Your continued existence was not part of the intended outcome," she continued, almost as if she needed to hear the structure of the mission again to anchor herself. And Ethan followed her gaze for a moment before returning to his bowl. "A lot of things are not," he said, taking another slow sip. The wind pressed lightly against the glass, a low, steady reminder of the outside world, and for a moment, the room felt suspended between two realities, one defined by directives and one defined by choice. She turned back to him, her expression unchanged but her focus sharpened. "I am required to complete the sequence," she said, and this time the words carried weight, not as a threat, but as a boundary she had not yet crossed. Ethan set his spoon down again, not abruptly, not defensively, just placing it beside the bowl with the same care he had used for everything else, and then he looked at her fully for the First time since she had sat down, meeting her gaze without challenge or expectation. Then you should probably finish your dinner first, he said, his voice even, almost gentle, and the statement landed in the space between them with more force than any command. Her eyes held his, searching again, deeper this time, scanning for manipulation, for strategy, for any indication that this was a calculated delay or an attempt to influence her decision. She found none. The absence itself became a variable she could not resolve. Outside, a faint flicker of light pulsed once from the direction of the wreck, a dying system cycling through its last reserves, and her attention snapped toward it instinctively, her body reacting before thought could intervene. The mission waited there, incomplete, unresolved, a line she had been trained to follow without deviation. But inside, the warmth remained constant, the scent of the soup lingering in the air, the quiet presence of a human who had offered nothing except space and sustenance. She looked back at the bowl, then at him, and for a fraction of a second, the timing of her next action did not align with any protocol she knew, and instead of reaching for the signal, she picked up the spoon again. The spoon moved again, slower this time, not because she lacked precision, but because something in the act itself had begun to require attention beyond calculation. The liquid had cooled slightly, the steam less aggressive now, curling upward in thinner strands that faded before reaching her face, and she watched it for a fraction longer than necessary before bringing the spoon to her lips. Ethan noticed the delay, the shift from efficiency to awareness, and he said nothing, letting the silence do what words would only interrupt. Outside, the faint pulsing from the wreck dimmed further, each cycle weaker than the last. A signal waiting to be completed but no longer urgent enough to demand immediate response. Your environment is inconsistent, she said after a moment, her voice quieter, as if the room itself required a different volume, and Ethan glanced around, taking in the uneven table, the patched walls, the single overhead light that buzzed faintly when it warmed. Yeah, he said, it is not built for anything specific, and she tilted her head slightly, processing. I was trained in controlled spaces, she replied. Every variable accounted for. Every outcome modeled. And Ethan nodded once, understanding more than he let on. That sounds exhausting, he said, and the word landed differently than she expected, not as criticism, but as recognition. She set the spoon down again, but not because she was finished, rather because her attention had shifted inward, towards something less tangible than the mission parameters that had defined her until now. Deviation introduces risk, she continued, her tone steady but softer. Uncertainty reduces efficiency, and Ethan leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table, his hands loosely clasped as if he were considering the statement rather than opposing it. Maybe, he said, or maybe it gives you a reason to choose instead of just follow. And that word lingered longer than anything else he had said so far. Choose. It did not translate cleanly into her framework, not in the way he used it, not as an optional variable, but as something central, something that altered the structure instead of fitting inside it. Her gaze shifted again toward the window, toward the darkness where the wreck remained, and this time the pull was not immediate, not absolute. The mission existed, yes, but it no longer occupied the entire field of possibility. The sequence requires activation within a limited time frame, she said, almost as if reminding herself, and Ethan followed her gaze again, then shrugged slightly. Then you have a little time left, he replied, his voice even, unhurried, as if time itself could be negotiated simply by refusing to rush. The overhead light flickered once more, a brief dip that cast their shadows across the walls in uneven shapes, stretching and compressing before settling again, and in that moment, the room felt smaller, more contained, like a space carved out from something much larger and less forgiving. She looked back at him, studying not his posture or his movements, but the absence of pressure in everything he did, the way he did not fill the silence, did not push, did not demand resolution. You are not attempting to influence the outcome, she said, and Ethan gave a small shake of his head. No, he answered, then added after a beat. I just made dinner, and the simplicity of it disrupted her again, not because she did not understand the words, but because she could not map them to any function she recognized. Outside, The last visible flicker from the wreck faded into darkness, leaving only the faint outline of disturbed earth beneath the trees, and inside, the warmth remained, steady and unchanged. She looked at the bowl again, then at her own hands, then back at him, and for the first time since she had entered the house, the next step in her sequence was not immediately clear, not because the data was missing, but because something else had been introduced, something that did not fit into any calculation she had ever been trained to complete. The silence stretched longer this time, not empty, but dense, like the air before a storm that never quite arrives. Ethan shifted slightly in his chair, not out of discomfort, but to reach for the edge of the table where an old cloth sat folded, its fabric worn thin from years of use, and he absent-mindedly ran it between his fingers as if grounding himself in something familiar. Across from him, she had stopped moving entirely, the spoon resting in her hand without purpose, her gaze fixed, somewhere between the bowl and the window, caught in a space that had no clear direction. "Your system is delaying," she said at last, though her voice carried a subtle distortion, not mechanical, but something closer to uncertainty. Ethan glanced at her, then followed her line of sight toward the dark window, where nothing moved and nothing answered. "Maybe it is waiting," he said, his tone steady, offering the thought without insisting on it. She turned her head slightly, the motion slower than before, as if even that required consideration. "Waiting is not a function," she replied, and Ethan gave a small nod. "Not for you," he said, then added, "but for us, sometimes it is the only thing we have," and the words settled into the room without explanation, carrying a weight she could not immediately define. Outside, the forest remained still, the earlier disturbance now absorbed into the night as if it had never happened, but she knew better. The mission was still there, embedded in her, structured, precise, and incomplete. Her hand tightened slightly around the spoon, not enough to break it, but enough to register the tension she had not yet released. "If I do not complete the sequence," she said, her voice quieter now, almost internal, "correction will follow." And Ethan leaned forward just enough to rest his elbows on the table again, his posture unchanged, his presence steady. "Sounds like you have been told that a lot," he said, not questioning, not challenging, just recognizing the pattern. She did not respond immediately. Instead, her eyes shifted again, this time not to the window, not to the wreck, but to him, studying something she had not prioritized before. His breathing, slow and even, his hands relaxed, his expression unguarded in a way that did not make sense in a scenario like this. "You are not concerned with your survival," she observed, and Ethan exhaled softly, almost a quiet laugh, though there was no humor in it. "I am," he said, then paused, choosing the next words carefully. "Just not in the way you think." And that distinction lingered, unresolved, but present. She lowered her gaze again, this time to her own hand, to the faint tremor that had begun to appear at the edges of her control, a subtle signal her body was sending that her systems were not fully aligned. She had accounted for damage, for delay, for environmental interference, but not for this. Not for the way the sequence had slowed without a clear cause. "Your behavior introduces anomaly," she said, the words sounding less like accusation and more like diagnosis, and Ethan nodded slightly. "Yeah," he said, "that happens sometimes." As if anomaly were just another part of the day, the overhead light buzzed. Faintly again, a low electrical hum that filled the gaps between their words, and the clock on the wall ticked forward, second by second, marking time in a way her internal systems did not need, but could not ignore. She looked at it, briefly, then back at him, and for the first time, the mission did not feel immediate. It felt distant, like something she could reach, but had not yet decided to. The spoon lowered slowly back into the bowl, the liquid rippling outward in soft circles, and her hand remained there, hovering, as if the next action required more than instruction. Ethan watched the movement without reacting, without prompting, his presence unchanged, and in that stillness, something shifted again, not in the environment, not in the mission parameters, but in her, a subtle realignment that had no name in her training. Outside, the night held steady, and inside, the decision remained unmade, but no longer inevitable. The clock ticked again, and this time she heard it as more than sound. Each second no longer just a measure, but a narrowing corridor. Her internal systems confirmed what she already knew. The activation window was closing, not abruptly, but with a precision that left no room for interpretation. Outside, beyond the walls, beyond the trees, something waited for her signal, something that did not question, did not hesitate, did not share meals or pause for warmth. It would act, clean and exact, the way she had always been taught to act. Her hand moved slightly, not toward the bowl, not toward him, but toward her wrist where the faint line of light pulsed beneath the surface. The control interface embedded deeper than muscle, deeper than instinct. Ethan saw the movement, not the mechanism, but the intent behind it, the shift from stillness to decision, and he did not stand, did not reach, did not interrupt. Instead, he leaned back just a fraction, giving her space as if the choice belonged entirely to her, because it did. "That is it, then," she said, not looking at him, her gaze fixed somewhere between the table and the unseen horizon beyond the walls. The words were not cold, not sharp, just final in a way that echoed the structure she had been built to follow. Ethan nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible motion. "Yeah," he said quietly. "That is usually how it goes." And there was no accusation in it, no plea, just acknowledgement. Her fingers hovered over the activation point, the faint glow responding to proximity, awaiting confirmation. Every system within her aligned, ready to complete the sequence, to return the world to a state where variables were controlled and outcomes were known. And yet, the motion did not complete. Something in the alignment felt incomplete, not mechanically, but structurally, as if a required element had not been accounted for. Her gaze shifted, just slightly, toward the bowl in front of her, now half empty. The surface still warm, still carrying the faint scent that had no tactical value, and yet had altered her processing. Then to him, sitting there without tension, without resistance, without even the instinct to escape. "You understand what will occur," she said, her voice steady but quieter than it had been when she first entered, and Ethan met her eyes, not defiant, not resigned, just present. "Probably," he said, then added after a moment, "but I figured you should not do it on an empty stomach." And the simplicity of it fractured something deeper than logic. Her systems did not reject the statement, but they could not integrate it either. It existed outside the parameters of efficiency, outside the structure of mission, outside everything she had been trained to prioritize. The glow at her wrist pulsed once, brighter now, awaiting input, the sequence ready, the outcome inevitable if she allowed it to be. The clock ticked again. The overhead light hummed. The house held its quiet. And in that narrow space between activation and action, she hesitated, not because she could not complete the sequence, but because for the first time, she recognized that completion was not the same as choice. Her hand lowered, slowly, the glow dimming as distance increased, the system registering the delay as anomaly. "This is inefficient," she said, but the word no longer carried authority, only observation. Ethan gave a small nod, as if agreeing with something obvious. "Yeah," he said softly. "Most good things are." And the sentence lingered in the air, simple, unguarded, impossible to categorize. Outside, nothing moved. Inside, nothing forced the next step. And for the first time since the mission had begun, the outcome was no longer predetermined. Not by failure, not by interference, but by something far less precise and far more human. The glow at her wrist faded completely, not abruptly, but with a quiet finality, like a system that had been given an answer it did not expect and chose to accept anyway. The room did not change, the light still hummed, the clock still marked each second with mechanical certainty, but something fundamental had shifted, something that could not be reversed by recalculation. She remained still for a moment longer, her hand hovering where the activation point had been, as if waiting for a correction that never came. And when it did not, she lowered it fully to the table. Outside, the darkness held, uninterrupted, the absence of signal echoing outward into a silence that would be interpreted elsewhere, analyzed, flagged, but not immediately understood. Inside, Ethan exhaled slowly, not relief, not tension, just a breath that had been waiting without him realizing it. "Sequence incomplete," she said, her voice softer than it had ever been, not as a report, but as a realization, and Ethan nodded once. Looks that way, he replied, his tone steady, unchanged, as if the outcome had always been just another possibility. She looked at him then, really looked, not as a target, not as a variable, but as something that existed outside the structure she had been built to follow, and for a moment, the absence of classification felt heavier than any directive. Correction will come, she said, and this time the words carried something new, not certainty, not fear, but awareness. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, the wood creaking under the shift. Yeah, he said, then added, things usually do. And there was no strategy in it. No attempt to solve what came next, just acceptance of a world that did not always wait for answers. The silence returned, but it was different now, no longer a pause between actions, but a space where something had already been decided. She glanced toward the window again, toward the unseen horizon where the mission had dissolved into absence, and then back to the table, to the bowl in front of her, now empty except for a thin line of warmth that lingered at the bottom. Her fingers moved again, not toward the activation point, but toward the edge of the bowl, tracing its surface as if committing the shape, the texture, the experience to something deeper than memory. This was not part of the design, she said quietly, and Ethan gave a small, almost absent nod. Most things worth keeping are not, he replied, and the words settled into her in a way no directive ever had. Time passed, not measured by urgency now, but by presence, by the steady rhythm of a place that had not demanded anything from her except that she exist within it. Eventually, she stood, the movement controlled, but no longer rigid, her balance steadier than when she had entered, though not fully restored. Ethan did not rise immediately, giving her the same space he had given from the beginning, the same unspoken acknowledgement that whatever came next belonged to her. She moved toward the door, pausing only once, her hand resting lightly against the frame as if registering the boundary between two states of being. Target, she began, then stopped, the word incomplete, unnecessary, and after a moment, she continued. Ethan Cole, speaking his name not as a designation, but as recognition. He looked up at that, meeting her gaze, and for a second, neither of them spoke. Then he gave a small nod. Take care, he said, simple, unguarded, and she held his gaze for just a fraction longer before turning and stepping out into the night. The door closed behind her with a soft, familiar creak, and the house settled back into itself. The light humming, the clock ticking, the pot still warm on the stove. Ethan sat there for a while, staring at the empty bowl across from him, at the chair that had been occupied by something that should not have stayed and yet had, and he did not try to define it, did not try to make it fit into anything it was not. Outside, the forest remained quiet, the sky unchanged, but somewhere far beyond both of them, a system registered a failure it could not explain. Inside, Ethan reached for the bowl, turning it slightly in his hands, and after a moment, he set it back, down exactly where it had been, as if leaving the space intact mattered. The clock ticked forward, steady and indifferent, and in that small, quiet kitchen, nothing looked different, except for the absence of a decision that, for once, had not been made by force. He had not stopped a weapon. He had not changed a war. He had simply made dinner, and somehow, that had been enough.